Hello everyone, it's Mostrino here. As I mentioned at the end of the last video, today we're going to be talking about stems and stem separation. Now, something that you'd see from the vast majority of mixed contest finalists in the past few years and the vast majority of mixed contest mixes from the past few years is the usage of stems. Stems are really useful because if you can just isolate like just one element of a track, it gives you a lot more opportunity to mess around with it without having to worry about all the other elements. And stuff like acapellas as well, acapella mashups, being able to have an isolated acapella and slap it over something, you can get some really good combinations that would be much more difficult without the acapella because you'd have to worry about, maybe their drums don't line up as well, or maybe the chord progression doesn't match up super well. But when you just have the vocal, you don't need to worry about those things, and those combinations come in much more easily. So stems are an extremely useful tool and one that have been used very frequently in the mix contest. So it's usually the case that the more stems you can get your hands on, the better. A lot of tracks have stems from Splice. There were a lot of Splice remix competitions and Monster Cat tracks getting their stems placed there. Nowadays, remix competitions are put on Label Radar, but you can find a lot of acapellas and stems from Monster Cat tracks there. Even in the mix contest last year and in 2016, they gave out 3 acapellas in each one, so 6 in total. I talked about last time how Astronaut put some of their vocal stems on their SoundCloud page. A lot of artists can give out stems from time to time as well. I know Fowler has his on his Discord, and a lot of tracks use vocal samples from public sample packs. And if you can find those sample packs and know where the vocal is from, those are usually allowed in the mix contest as well. So there are plenty of opportunities to get your hands on some stems, which can give you some new opportunities for combinations, mashes, edits that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But while there are plenty of Monster Cat tracks that do have publicly available stems, those actually only make up a small minority of all of the Monster Cat tracks out there. But what is really sweet is that now there is new technology that allows us to get stems from full tracks. And this is a legit technique too. There are plenty of examples of mixed contest finalists using stem separation for the mix contest or for Call of the Wild takeovers, because it is really such a useful tool to be able to expand your ability to do combinations, get access to vocals that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise. So knowing which tools you can use for stem separation is going to be extremely useful for when you're trying to make these kind of mixes. And what's really nice is that now there are some websites where you can just upload the track and it'll do the stem separation for you, because the actual technology you can kind of download and run on your own, but usually you have to have at least a little bit of coding knowledge to get it to work. But with these websites, you don't need to have any of that. And I'll link these in the description. The one that I personally use and the one that I'm going to be using for this video is called melody.ml. But there are also other ones such as lalal.ai and AudioStrip that I've learned about, and I'll link those in the description too. So feel free to go ahead and try those, because they use slightly different variations in terms of the technology that's used to do the stem separation. So depending on the track, some of them might sound cleaner than others. That said, the ones that I personally cannot recommend would be Spleeter and Isotope RX. Both of these were extremely instrumental in getting this technology, more out there and really advancing how this technology is progressing. But now it's getting to the point where I'm consistently hearing worse results from Spleeter and RX compared to the ones that I had mentioned before. And while this technology is definitely really advanced and impressive, it's still new and definitely not quite as good as it can be. So what I've decided to do here is I've decided to make a couple examples so that we could see how clean the results are based on the input audio. That way you kind of know beforehand, if you look at how isolated the vocal is in the original track, you can kind of get an idea of what kind of quality you should expect from the stem separation. So for this, I'm using this vocal.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
Which is perfectly free to use in the mix contest. It is from The Girl by Hellberg, and those stems are available on Splice. So anyways, what I've decided to do is I've decided to make a couple of different stages where, you know, on this side the vocals are more isolated, whereas on this side they're a lot more buried, just to kind of give examples of what you might expect in actual tracks. Because, you know, in some tracks the instrumental is a lot lighter and the vocal is just kind of naturally more isolated, but other tracks might have the vocal playing on top of a lot of elements and getting it buried. So depending on the track that you're starting with, you can get drastically different results in terms of quality. So I'm just going to go ahead and play these just so you can see what we're starting out with. This first one is the Too Easy stage because it's literally just the vocal and a piano.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
Usually the tracks will not be this isolated unless it's like an acoustic or something. So this is just kind of why I'm calling it the Too Easy stage. This easy stage is a bit more realistic. You know, I brought in some strings and some rain ambience. And, you know, maybe in like the intro or the outro of a track, the instrumental is a lot softer and you might hear something like this.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
Then we get into the medium. You know, if you have like a chiller track, you might hear something like this in the verse where we have pads and bass and more ambience here. So there are definitely quite a few layers, but they're still made to try and keep the vocal at the forefront of the mix.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
Then we get into the hard mode where you're hearing some big, you know, noisy synths playing, and the vocal gets buried a lot more than in the previous examples.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
And then finally, I've got this ultra nightmare mode where it's got the same big synths, if not even bigger, as the hard mode, but it's also got all of these effects and these drums. And I want to make a point about these drums in just a moment, but here's what this one sounds like.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
So yeah, you know, if you have an instrumental like this, where there's just so much going on and the vocals are definitely not necessarily at the forefront of the mix, we will see what happens in just a moment. And like I said, I'll talk about the drums in a moment, but first let's go ahead and see what happens with the previous examples. So what Melody ML does is it gives you two options. One, you can just separate the vocals and the instrumental, and the other one, you can separate the vocals, the drums, the bass, and the instruments. So at least for these first few examples, I would imagine most of the people watching are just going to use Melody ML for vocals, trying to get some clean acapellas. But that doesn't mean that you can't use it for instrumentals. You know, sometimes they might come out cleaner than others. And of course, you can try the vocals, bass, instruments mode as well, just depending on what you're looking for. But since I'm imagining that most people are probably just going to be using it for the vocals, that's why I've just got the vocals here. So again, just to refresh your memory, if the Melody ML did everything perfectly, this is what the vocal should sound like.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars.
And here is what Melody ML spits out.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
I mean, that's almost perfect quality, isn't it? Like, that is absolutely usable. So if I got something like this as the vocals from Melody ML, I would be celebrating. How about on the easy mode? Let's see what it gives us there.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
So it's like the two easy vocals, except the reverb isn't really there anymore. It doesn't pick up much of the reverb, but the vocals are still very much audible. I would say that this is usable. It gets kind of rough over here, but I would still say that this is usable. How about the medium mode?
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
A little bit worse than the easy quality, and definitely not ideal quality, but I would still say that this is certainly usable. How about the hard mode?
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
So if I got vocals like this, I would really be reconsidering how badly do I want to use these vocals, because this audio quality is definitely pretty rough, and I would probably not use these vocals if they came out like this. And then finally, the Ultra Nightmare mode. And here's something that I wanted to talk about with the vocals, and this one in particular, is that when the drums come in, things are getting sidechained. And if I play the vocal,
she just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
notice how there's a bit of ducking from the sidechain? If you're trying to stem out vocals that are being sidechained, they're never going to come out not sidechained, because the vocal themselves are having their volume being ducking. So Melody ML's not going to magically make the sidechain go away. So the best that we could get would be this vocal with the sidechain. So that's something to keep in mind. And if your vocal stems do come out sidechained, I'll talk about some ways to kind of deal with that and react to that in just a moment. But here's how the Ultra Nightmare vocals came out.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that time forgot.
So, as expected, the quality is definitely rough, and I would absolutely not use these vocals if they came out like this. But the point that I wanted to talk about with the drums is that it also has the drums, bass, instruments separation mode as well. And if we listen to how the drums come out, and if we listen, these are what we should expect the kick and snare to sound like. And of course this has the clap layer. But I want you to notice that even on the Ultra Nightmare mode, the drums come out pretty good. You know, the claps definitely are not as clean as you would want, but at least the kicks and snares, you can definitely hear them. So something that I would certainly recommend, because this is something that I do personally a lot, is try running it for the drums. Because especially when you have a full track and you have drums on different sections of the track, even if the drums don't come out good on one portion of the track, there should still probably be at least like some part throughout the entire track where you might get a really clean kick or a really clean snare. And then if we think about what I was doing last video with using your own drum samples, Something that you can try and do is using the stem drums, because that way it sounds a lot more natural, because those are the actual drums that are used in the track. And even if the stem drums don't come out that great, you can maybe layer the stem drums with a sample. You know, there are a lot of different combinations, and it just allows you to get really clean drums that fit. Because I'm going to be talking about in the next video with the mashup techniques video, that's something, you know, if you're doing a mashup and the tracks that you're mashing together use very different drums, having a consistent set of drums will make the mashup sound a lot more cohesive. And try and stem out these drums. See if you can get a good kick and a good snare from the original track. That way, not only can you get consistent drums, but the drums don't feel out of place. Because I know, you know, depending on where you're coming from, some people have, you know, a bigger sample library than others and can easily find, you know, a sample that sounds really similar to the one used in a track. But in some cases, it might be hard to find a kick or a snare that really fits what you hear in the track. So using something like Melody ML to isolate the actual drums from the track can be a really effective tool in avoiding that problem. So anyways, I said that I was going to talk about what should you do if the vocals come out sidechained. Well, I would say probably the two best pieces of advice I could give you is, one, you know, if they're sidechained, maybe just put them over a track with drums so that the sidechaining mixes with the drums and it feels like it's supposed to be there. Or two, you can try chopping the sample around to get rid of the sidechained parts, and that can help as well, or using a little bit of compression to keep the volume a little bit more even. You're just going to have to try and do your best and hope that it works out. As far as on the topic of kind of making these vocals work, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is, okay, what if you've got a vocal that's not necessarily great quality, but it's usable? How can you maximize the quality? So for this, I'm going to use the medium vocals as the example.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that I forgot.
Because that's probably the lowest quality one here that I would use. By the time we get to the hard vocals,
she just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let
it would be much more difficult to actually implement those properly. So what I've got over here is I'm going to use For Me by Throttle. And the reason why I chose For Me by Throttle is because it's in the same key as The Girl, and it's in 127 BPM. The Girl is in 126, so we're going to want to stretch that. So let's bring in the vocals. And I'm just going to go ahead and normalize these. That just brings them to their kind of maximum amplitude. And then here, we're going to use the Stretch Pro mode. And just like we talked about in the first video, type in BPM. This is in 126. And there we go. So my kind of thoughts for this is what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to have these vocals come in during this part of the drop. Because there isn't really a vocal playing in the original For Me, so you know, maybe throwing these the girl vocals in here will help that out. So first thing is first, let's go ahead and line these up. And also, something that I should mention, because I've been doing this without saying it, if you drag this like this, it snaps to the grid, but if you hold Alt while dragging it, you can do these really fine adjustments, which is what I'm doing right now to get it on time. And I'm just kind of doing it by ear. You know, just kind of hearing it by ear if it's coming in a little early or a little late.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's I forgot.
So right off the bat, you can probably notice that a lot of the artifacts in the Melody ML
She's falling too far.
just kind of go away when you put these on top of each other.
She's falling too far with salt in her.
In fact, it makes me wonder how it would sound like if I put the hard vocals in here, if those would work as well. So let's bring those in here because I'm kind of curious.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too
So these ones I actually think are salvageable, surprisingly, because when you hear them by themselves, they're definitely not great. Like, I would not want to use these vocals, but when you put them on top of For Me, I realized that we can actually maybe salvage these. So I'm gonna actually try using these, and I'm just gonna show you kind of the tricks that I do to maximize the quality of the vocals. So the first thing that I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm gonna set these to their own little mixer track, as I will for Me. So this one will be For Me, and this one will be The Girl. And the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to make sure that I sidechain the girl to For Me, because that'll make it sound a lot smoother and it'll allow the drums in For Me to pop out a lot more. So we just go ahead, maybe do a little volume automation clip and see how that goes. And then I'm just gonna hit B for the brush tool, and then I can just click and drag to bring these all the way out, and then P for the pen again.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with something else gone. She just shed serious. She's falling too far with something else gone. Already taste the tears. She's falling too far.
And the next thing is going to be our usage of EQ. And you can see in the top here, you know, maybe a little bit of artifacts in the low end. I'm not sure where those might have come from. So even though those probably aren't even audible, it doesn't hurt to just get rid of those. So let's go up and load in our EQ. And let's go ahead and take these out. And another thing I'm noticing is it's lacking a lot of high end compared to For Me. Feels very muffled, so let's go ahead and bring that up.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with something else goes.
But what you might be noticing is that as I bring that high end up, those like S's and those T's become very strong.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far.
And we don't want that. So what I'm going to use right now is I'm going to use a free plugin called TDR Nova. You can also set this up using just stock plugins in Patcher, but since that's more complex, I'm not going to do that right now. But if you want a video on that, let me know. But with TDR Nova, when we open this one up, it's a dynamic EQ. And basically what that means is instead of a regular EQ where, like, let's say you're taking off, you know, this much in the 300 hertz region, and that just stays static. What TDR Nova does is we want high end, but we don't want high end during those S's and those T's that are really sharp. So what this TDR Nova is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to take down the high end only during those S's and those T's and not during the rest of the vocal. So if we go ahead and click this, and I'm just going to make it, instead of being a shelf, I'm just going to make it a peak. And then here, when we adjust this threshold, the more that we turn the threshold down, the more sensitive it's going to be to the high frequency content. And the more we turn the ratio, that's like, once this gets up to this level, it's going to clamp down on it even more. And I'm going to turn up the Q a little bit more because I don't want it, the frequency range it's affecting, to be too broad. I just want to clamp down on these specific frequencies.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with something else goes. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
And now you can see how it's mostly only clamping down once you hear those S's and T's. And I like TDR Nova as well. Beyond just being free, I like the visual feedback that it gives. So if we hear without it,
she just shed serious.
Versus with,
she just shed serious. She's falling too far with something else gone.
You can hear that it's a big difference. Another thing that I'm going to use to even out the vocals, I'm going to do some compression. And I don't really use the stock compressors. So to keep things free, I'm going to use another TDR Tokyo Dawn Records plugin. let's use the TDR Kotelnikov. And basically what this threshold means is it means that once the vocal hits 0 dB, it starts compressing. If you turn this down, it starts compressing at lower volumes of the vocal. When you turn this ratio up, the amount of compression becomes a lot stronger. And what happens when you compress the vocal is that usually the output signal gets quieter since you're bringing the vocal down. So this makeup kind of compensates for that. And then these attacks and releases just how quickly the compressor is acting. So I'm just going to kind of dial these knobs in by ear, but using some sort of compressor to even out the vocal is going to help a whole lot.
She just shakes her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
And as you can see, we're still getting some pretty high peaks there. I'm just going to use the stock Fruity limiter to tame and remove those. And as far as the Fruity limiter goes, the only things you really got to worry about are these 5 buttons: the gain, the ceiling, the attack, release, and sustain. So what the gain does is it's how loud is the audio going into the limiter. The ceiling is what's the maximum volume we're going to allow. So if the ceiling's at 0, then that means that none of the audio coming out of the limiter is going to be allowed to go past 0. And what these attack, release, and sustain knobs do is if you turn these down, then when the audio is too loud, it'll distort it. And when you turn these up, then when the audio is too loud, it will make it quieter. So usually you're going to want to kind of adjust these by ear. I feel like the distortion, if it's in small amounts, is less noticeable than when these are turned higher. But it just kind of depends on how drastically you're limiting. So I'm just going to kind of dial these knobs in.
She just shakes her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
So there we go. Now all of those peaks are taken care of. And I'm going to, just for good measure, I'm going to bring the highs up once more, just because I feel like they're still a little bit low.
She just shakes her ears.
As well as some of these more fundamental frequencies.
She just shakes her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
And there are a few other tricks that you can employ to make this vocal even cleaner. Let's say I bring these all down. I'm going to put this effect at the very top. I'm going to add the kilohertz stereo, which is free. I'm not sure. I think maybe the Fruity stereo shaper might be able to do this as well, but I just find I just like how simple the kilohertz stereo is. Basically, if I take out all of the mids, the thing with the kilohertz stereo is when you turn down the width, it's not just pushing the side signals to mono. If you don't know what side and mono is, don't worry about it. But it's not just pushing the side signals to mono, but it's actually just deleting the side signals, which is what we want here. So if I take out the mids, if you're listening on a phone speaker, you might not be able to hear anything if it's just a mono speaker. And now if I turn down the width and just have the mids,
She just shakes her ears.
notice how when I have both the mids and the width,
She just shakes her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars.
you get more artifacts on the sides that just go away when you turn the width down to 0.
She just shakes her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
You see, it sounds significantly cleaner when we turn the width down to 0. But in order to fill out the vocal and bring some of that width back, the last thing that I'm going to add is some reverb. And now, I said that I would keep things stock in a previous video, but since I'm already using so many non-stock plugins, I'm just going to use another non-stock but free plugin, the Valhalla Supermassive. I love this one for vocals in particular. I'm just going to turn this delay down, because what the Valhalla Supermassive is it's a mix of a delay plugin and a reverb plugin, but if you turn these warp and densities to max, then it's just reverb, which is what we want. And the mix kind of determines how loud the reverb is relative to the dry signal. And then the feedback helps with how long is the reverb going to last. These low and high EQs, I'll just tell you guys this right now. Usually you do not want any, or at least a lot of low end on your reverb just because of how sensitive the low end is. So I'm going to pull that up to a few hundred hertz. And then we might want to turn down the high as well, but I'm going to listen first and see how this sounds.
She just shed serious.
And since the kind of S's and T's are reverberating so much, I am going to turn down the highs.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears. She's falling too far. The girl that's up the gun.
And something we can do to hide the artifacts even more is I'm just going to turn down the makeup on the compressor.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with salt in her.
And I'm also going to turn down the highs.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far with salt in her scars. Won't let it taste her tears.
And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to pull up an EQ to see what are the prominent frequencies of the vocal.
She just shed serious.
And definitely somewhere around here in the 400-500 range, we can see some peaks.
She just shed serious. She's falling too far.
As well as up here in kind of the 15-1600 and in the 4K. So let's just kind of keep those in mind. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go into For Me, put an EQ on that, and just make some pretty modest dips in those areas so that we can keep the vocal quiet so you don't hear the artifacts as easily, but it still cuts through. What was the next one, like 15-1600? And then this last one, 4K. And now, here's how it sounds like without the EQ. And then with. So the vocal pops out a lot more. But like I mentioned, you know, the vocal was very rough to begin with and I probably wouldn't work with it. But if we were trying something like these medium vocals, I would definitely say that we've got these clean enough to work with even though they're not the best quality. Here's with no effects. And then here's with the effects that we added. And the other thing that I wanted to mention really quickly, this is important because notice how when we're taking off these frequencies for Me, it makes a difference, right? Without them. And then with. And we don't have the vocal playing during the drop. So what I would do is I would go ahead and make this one unique. This one can have the EQ, but then when we go into this first one, we're just going to set it so that it has no effects on it. So that way we're not taking out frequencies when we don't need to. And in fact, maybe we can even dial back the dips a little bit. You know, we're taking out some 4 dB here. Maybe we only take out maybe 2.5. And that should still do the job. part of it's just going by ear and dialing in those settings. I'm sure that these settings that I've got right now can be dialed in even better since I'm just doing it here for the video. But I would say the biggest takeaways, you know, especially with the stereo, remember how many artifacts we heard just from the width here.
She just sheds her ears.
So taking out the sides, or at least dialing them back, you know, maybe we don't want to take them out all the way, but we do want to turn them down.
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her sky.
Though I do think in this case, turning them to 0 might be the best play. But taking out the sides, you know, doing EQ, taking out the lows, you definitely don't need anything in the sub region for the vocals. And making sure that the frequency content kind of matches for me, because we saw that for me was, you know, it definitely had some stuff going on in the high end. So we're trying to replicate that with the girl. You know, maybe try and getting a plugin like TDR Nova to tame some of the S's and T's if you are turning up the highs. Using some sort of compression. It really doesn't even need to be TDR Kotelnikov. You can just use whatever works for you. And of course, using reverb's definitely going to help, especially if you're taking out the sides, then reverb will be able to bring in some of the sides in. But the difference is we're bringing it in with reverb. We're not bringing it in with artifacts. So we're replacing the artifacts in the side signals with a lot more smooth, clean reverb. And of course, making sure, you know, if there's any peaks that are still in the way, throwing on some sort of a limiter or something to just kill the peaks at the end will be great. And the final thing, of course, is to make sure that the vocal really pops out, you know, to prevent you from having to turn the vocal up and make it super loud, just go into the instrumental track and take dips in the parts of the vocal that are the most prominent. Because if I play this with the EQ turned off,
She just sheds her ears. She's falling too far with salt in her sky. Won't let it taste her teeth.
notice how the vocals pop out a lot more when we're taking those kind of modest dips from the instrumental track. Also sidechaining, don't forget the sidechain too. That makes a difference as well. And, you know, being smart about what kind of vocal quality you're wanting to isolate, because with those hard vocals, you know, we did do some work on them, but even after it, you could tell that the quality wasn't really that great. So if you're being smart about which tracks you isolate and the kind of quality vocals that you get out of them, it'll make your life a lot easier when you're trying to clean up these vocals, because you can try and salvage a really poor quality vocal, but it might not end up working. Whereas if you have a track that's okay quality or good quality but not necessarily great, you'll be able to salvage it a lot easier and be able to have it sound a lot cleaner. And of course, it depends on what kind of mashups you're doing, right? Because if I was putting this vocal over, you know, just like a piano, the artifacts would be a lot more noticeable. But if you put it over a really busy track, then the busyness and the elements of the instrumental track will help to cover a lot of those artifacts for you. So I think that that's about everything that I wanted to cover with this one. And tomorrow I'll actually be talking about the mashup techniques in tomorrow's video, unless I change something else last second. But as of right now, I will be talking about the mashup techniques in tomorrow's video. Again, if it shows as unavailable, it'll be going up tomorrow. And yeah, I think that's about it. I'll see you guys tomorrow.